morning, Anna. Good morning to everybody.
Morning, how are you?
I'm okay. How are you?
Good, fine, thank you.
Great.
All right, we're here to discuss obviously the budgets and the various impacts it's had on different sectors of the economy. But perhaps now to kick off with what is the most important disappointment or pleasing thing about the budget? Would you like to talk about the public servants freeze?
Okay, thank you very much. And obviously, from our perspective, the biggest issue at this moment for South Africa is unemployment. And it's unemployment in the context of its history, a crisis where we have been dealing with before 1994, a crisis that we're dealing with post 1994, now 25 years into democracy. Unfortunately, for us, this is a worsening problem. It's a crisis that is getting deeper and deeper, and it discriminates people three ways. It discriminates people on the basis of their race. It discriminates people on the basis of their age. It discriminates people according to their sex. And lastly, I should have said, it discriminates people in terms of its geography, and the spatial development patterns that were designed by the apartheid. So that's, to me and to SATFU, the issue. More so because there was a coincidence in that the Statistics South Africa issued a damning condemnation of government dismal record in terms of providing employment during the pandemic and before. They told us that there was a net 1.4 million workers, or an extraordinary 8.5% of employed workers who lost their jobs in between the last quarter of 2019 and the last quarter of 2020. And that includes 11% jobs lost in the Eastern Cape, 10% lost in Gauteng. And we can go on sectorally to mention the other biggest losers in terms of the sectors of the economy. For example, the craft sector lost 13% of its job net. The domestics lost 11.5%. And this is what is creating what we believe is an unsustainable political crisis, a social implosion that is already happening in South Africa, which we choose to ignore at our own peril. In our view, that social instability is reflected in the following. One, already we are losing our youth in the townships to drugs and to violence. They are being recruited by the drug lords who are using them as pawns in their territorial wars against each other. And this issue of a drug abuse in the townships have become a pandemic. Nyaope is freely available, mandrax, and all kinds of other drugs, which we seemingly know exactly who is peddling them. If you hear a minister of police saying, we know who is pushing these drugs, but you don't see how many of these drug lords are being arrested, you have to be despondent. That's the first point. The second social crisis is the levels of violence and crime in our society. I mean, when you have a society already where 58 bodies get picked up every day in our streets, 58 people killed on average a single day, man, that's a country at war with itself. That's a massive social implosion. And let's face it, the reason why we are such a violent and crime-ridden country is related to the first issue we are addressing, the crisis of unemployment. And there is a levels of depression and stress in this country that are not equivalent, that are not matched by any other country. The rates at which people are committing suicide in the Western Cape, for example, is extraordinarily abnormal. And the source of all of that has to be principally that our youth are losing hope, and that our youth are now being trapped into all of this antisocial behavior and activities. So that's to us the issue. If you ask us to measure any government performance, it has to be whether the economy is addressing the first challenge facing our people, and that is of unemployment. So if you were to ask me what is my biggest disappointment, I would say that the minister hardly even mentioned those frightening statistics yesterday. I mean, to have 9 provinces, and out of 9, 7 of them have unemployment rate in terms of the expanded definition, which is the real definition of unemployment, above 40%, 7 out of 9. And with the Eastern Cape now above 52%. Man, we warned about a ticking bomb, some of us, ages ago. The levels of that violence I was speaking about is the beginnings of the implosions. The levels of service delivery protest across the country, and is the beginnings of that social instability. The fact that all of our cities are surrounded by a ring of fire with protest on daily basis, counted to be up between 12 and 13,000 by the police official reports annually, is the beginning of that implosion. So did the budget speak to that? Did it give us an assurance that this government is appreciating the scale of the challenge that South Africa faces at this particular moment, as it has been facing this during colonial and apartheid era? No.
What would you have liked to have seen?
If we were in a position to influence the government, the first thing that we would have said is to borrow from Albert Einstein, who said, one of the signs of somebody going crazy is that they keep on doing the same thing over and over and hoping for a different result. We think that the government is refusing to take its head out of the sand. The government is refusing to learn from other experiences elsewhere in the world. The government is in denial about the dismal failure of its economic programs and policies pursued in the past 25 years. So the first thing we would have liked to hear is a government that will say, guys, it's 25 years now of worsening poverty, unemployment, and inequalities. The policies we love that we have been pursuing have not helped us, have failed us dismally. We're now going back to the drawing board. That's what I think this country needs. We need to go back to the drawing board and ask ourselves questions. What are these real structural problems and deficiencies this economy is facing that makes it to reproduce poverty, unemployment, and inequalities? In our view as SATFU, the biggest deficiency of this economy is that it is still largely, not entirely, largely dominated by 3 big sectors in the economy as designed by the colonial masters. Is still dominated by mining, as reflected by the fact that mining products constitute almost 60% and above of all of our export earnings. No matter how shrinking our gold and steel is, but that's still a reality. The second issue is that our economy still is dominated by the finance sector, which dictates policy by using the sheer power of resources they have. 5 big banks basically are playing music, and our government and all of us are dancing to their tune. They have enormous power, huge power, and they are not helping that power to break down the biggest impediments and the crisis that we are facing. The third is that of the energy, in particular of the oil oligarchs, the Sasos of this world. We have an economy that is designed to be export orientated. Its main activity remains extraction of the mineral resources of the country and sending them raw to the external economies without insisting on beneficiating them here, without building secondary industries here, without ensuring that there are value chains built here in South Africa. When you have an economy that is still based and its infrastructure remains that the best of our infrastructure are the roads going to the airports and to the harbors, and that whilst we're talking about the 4th industrial revolution for a tiny minority, the overwhelming majority of our people have been left out of even the 1st industrial revolution. They still need clean running water. They have no access to proper graveled, not even tarred, proper graveled roads. They have no access to sanitation or facilities. They have no access to electricity in bigger parts. And when we have the overwhelming majority still trapped in that, not overwhelming majority, when we have big sections of community trapped in the society outside even the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th industrial revolution, you have a trouble. You have a big problem in your hands, and so that's what we would have said. We would have said to the government, you have to commit to overall this economy, turn it upside down, make sure that the mineral resources and are kept in South Africa and are not an exclusive owned by the multinational corporation. Address the land hunger question of our people, and from there rebuild industrial strength of South Africa, beneficiate here, build secondary industries here, ensure that we reverse the fortunes of the manufacturing sector, which used to contribute 20% plus, and on the eve of the collapse of apartheid, which is now down to 11, 12%. Address that as your primary concern, and your infrastructure has to be about rebuilding that industrial capacity of the country. Introduce R&Ds to ensure that we can cope with the globalization and the competitiveness of our industries today. Confront the education system in South Africa as your structural problem, which continues to have 3 main features. The first feature is that it sidelines millions, almost 50 to 52% at times, of kids who register at grade 1 do not arrive at grade 12 in the prescribed 12-year period. Secondly, we can't compete with the world when it comes to reading with meaning up to grade 4. Grade 5s cannot compete with their peers elsewhere in the world on mathematics. I was just seeing headlines about new statistics that shows that in terms of the quality, our education is going down. And yet, year in, year out, we get misled into celebrating 76% miraculously. We have 76% pass rate on a year that the overwhelming majority of the kids in the townships and rural areas would have had no access to emails, to internet, and to these online teachings by their teachers. But we celebrate. It's now in our blood. We celebrate, but we do not celebrate the fact that we are walking up the ladder in terms of those key indicators. That's a second big the other big structural impediment facing South Africa today. Our education system. I'm not going to speak about health, and which remains in a deep crisis. I'm not going to speak about crime, because that too is a big structural impediment. And I will not speak about the capacity of the state to do anything, bad or good, neoliberal or left-wing. The capacity has been hollowed out over the past 25 years, and that's reflected in the crisis of Eskom, the crisis in Denel, in Brasa, in Transnet, in Petro SA, at SABC, you name them all. That's a reflection of the hollowing out of the state, and by the ANC government, not in the 9 years of wasted years, by the 25 years of wasted years of the ANC, in our view.
Yet government's still throwing money at these SOEs. What is your thought on that?
Look, we are openly socialists, and we don't want to hide that, so that we do not have a debate that is misplaced. We want a strong, development-orientated government with capacity to lead development, to crowd in private sector investment. That's what we want. We would therefore, and that's why we were marching yesterday, we're decrying the fact that Eskom, a leading energy producer just 25 years ago, competing and beating all its peers in the world, is now on its knees with a 450 to 480 debt crisis, switching electricity left, right, and center, compounding the crisis we are facing of a wrong economic policies in our view, of misplaced fiscal and monetary policies, and making the crisis of this pandemic of corona even far more bitter to swallow than it would have been the case. Eskom is the biggest challenge, a biggest impediment to economic growth and retainment of jobs in South Africa. So we would have liked to have persons employed there with capacity. We hate the fact that we have employed a CEO as we speak, who comes from the private sector, who's a lawyer, who have no engineering experience, who's still going to have to rely on internal capacity and its agendas to turn around the fortunes of Eskom. We hate that their key other personnel are drawn out of Eskom, no internal experience, and to help turn around that situation. As a result, we continue to read in the Pretoria news just 2 days ago about rising tensions and of parliamentary officials and leadership crying foul that the reports are not forthcoming, and all of that. So yes, we want Eskom saved. Yes, we are having a huge debate in terms of how we do that. Yes, we are considering amongst those issues as to whether a return to a prescribed investment era of the apartheid that helped us develop these institutions in the first place is not a thing to consider now. But we even discouraged to have such discussions because of the extent of corruption in the public and private sectors. Every time you even mention prescribed investment in South Africa, workers turn around and say, are you crazy? Have you not listened to the PIC inquiry? Didn't you hear how our pensions help further the nest of the elites who are corrupt and who looted billions out of our pension funds as public sector employees. So the debate doesn't go there, but it doesn't mean that the crisis is over. The crisis is there. We would have liked to see an SAA that continues to be providing a moment of pride to every South African, that will fly our flag high across the globe. An SAA that was in the position to occupy position number one in every respect: reliability, safety, caring for its customers and the people who are using it as moving from inside and everywhere. We were occupying number one spot not long ago. What did we do? We collapsed it, and we helped the people who are at the ideological level opposed to the improved and enhanced the role of the state to basically throw the baby with the bathwater, to say the state mustn't be involved in activities such as those that Dinel used to excel on, those that Petro SA used to excel on, or Prasa. Today, you know, the workers in Gauteng have no access to trains. The whole infrastructure has been removed, completely removed. The entire rail network, including the cables. Where was the government? Where was the state? It was there. And that's why sometimes we develop conspiracy theories as to whether there's no relationship between our leaders and this underground world of people who are using the scrap metal. At some point, and throughout, these people were being allowed, and we were the only country allowing the exportation of the scrap metal. What is the relationship between that and the reality of allowing the entire rail, the entire system to be rooted out by criminals in Gauteng, to the point that now workers are being forced into the moving coffins, the taxis, exposed to danger and late arrivals at work and all that goes with it. So yes, we're strong proponents of a developmental active state that can lead development, but that have capacity to crowd in private investment and redirect it, plan around redirecting that investment towards the biggest priorities of South Africa. And this point, the biggest priority of South Africa is manufacturing, is building that industrial base again.
Practically, how do you address this short term? Because like reinstating all the railway lines is going to take years and lots of money. So on a short-term basis, how do you see government moving forward to address these problems of Eskom and SAA and PRASA?
That's a difficult question, and we don't underestimate how significant and a difficult task this whole pillaging of the state has meant in terms of repairing and putting us back to where we were. Shamedly, where we were just before 1994, we had a robust industrial sector. We had a robust SAA, Eskom, Dinel, PRASA, and everything. How could it be that the liberators will go and tell the next generation that we were there and we allowed the collapse and the hollowing out of that capacity? We threw everything we inherited from apartheid, and instead we positioned ourselves to eat, whilst workers have no public transport at this point. How could anybody be proud of that? In our view, the current leadership should hang their heads in shame. Having said that, we have been championing the need for a kickstart of this economy, and we were inspired by what we saw elsewhere in the world. The world responded two ways to the 2008 economic meltdown. Germany, based on its solid industrial base, took the entire Western Europe in the main into responding to that 2008 through austerity program, cutting government expenditure left, right, and center, and keeping the debt to GDP intact, keeping inflation and driving down interest rates as part of that intervention. The USA, which was the epicenter of that 2008 crisis, decided that no, we're not going to follow an austerity program. We're going to do qualitative easing. We're going to be empowering our bank to intervene in the economy directly and so that they do not continue to collapse and jobs are not lost in the process. And that's what we believe South Africa should do. So we championed a need for a 500 billion rand stimulus package to be introduced in the country, and so that we can save firms from collapsing. We can intervene to save workers and everybody from seeing their standards of living collapsing. And we were big fans of this, and we still are. We are disappointed that the president keeps on telling South Africa an untruth, that he responded to that by putting on the table a 500 billion fiscal stimulus, which would have meant that there is a 10% of the GDP on the table to intervene and to stop us reading the statistics we were reading on Monday about this job loss calamity. The president is not telling us the truth. The reality is that he embarked on a strategy to borrow from John to pay Peter. He squeezed all the line budgets, including the service delivery front lines. And when economists calculated, they said actually only 36 billion rands of that 500 was the new money. And that constitutes around 3% of the GDP. And that's why, despite that so-called stimulus package of 500, the crisis is deepening of many small macro enterprises collapsing without assistance, of many big firms in this country facing serious challenges of sustainability. And the only people who have been smiling again has been in the main the financial sector, which for the first time though got affected in terms of the job losses that we are seeing. And so there's no stimulus in South Africa. We would like to speak about the stimulus. Joe Biden, which we always thought that the Democrats in the USA are on the right of the ANC, is suddenly on the left of the ANC government in South Africa, have put together a proposal for a 1.9 trillion stimulus package to save firms from collapsing and to save jobs and to save people from falling below the poverty line. We won't even attempt to do something as real as that in South Africa. So what are we seeing? Social implosion driven by this massive budget cuts across the economy. This is very sad to us.
How much politicking is involved here?
There's politics everywhere. And there are politics that are based on the reality that we live in a class-based society. We are divided. We are two countries in one. There's one country which is constituted by 10% of the population. That 10% owns the wealth of 90% of the country. 90% is owned by 10% of the population. There's a 90% of the population that have to share 10% of the wealth of the country. We are divided in class terms to many in that 10%. who are narrow in thinking, who do not care about the future, who can't see the signs of a social implosion that I was speaking about. They were celebrating yesterday. Champagne bottles were being shaken hard because they happy that the government has now reduced the corporate taxes further from 52% on the eve of the collapse of apartheid, driven to 28%, now going down to 27%. They're saying this is the best news they've ever anticipated. In a country with this massive social deficit, our government cut taxes, even in the middle class. In our view, what message are you sending? Here you have 42% of your population unemployed. You have 52% of your African Black women unemployed. You've got 52% of unemployment in one of your provinces. You have 63% of your youth below the age of 24 unemployed. You make no real statement of solidarity. You cut taxes to those who can afford a little bit more in order to send a message to the downtrodden that we are with you even at this moment of the pandemic. Nothing of that kind. So yes, the minister would have spoken to the 10% of the population. It is excited, but the 90% was marching in the streets yesterday and will continue to do so in the coming months.
Okay, to play devil's advocate, by cutting those taxes, is it not creating more employment?
Exactly. That's a problem South Africa have been chasing. We stupidly, in our view, naively, thought that once we limit the government role to be that of a referee in the economy with such massive inequalities, once we limit the government role into being the creator of an conducive environment to help the private sector gain confidence and therefore invest in the economy, we naively believe that that will be reciprocated by the private sector. Unfortunately, 25 years down the line, we have not seen any reciprocation, none whatsoever. Instead of the private sector helping the government, its ideology that everything must be driven by the market. Instead of that, the government have been discrediting even that notion. And I'm not saying that government have no role. Please don't misunderstand us. All governments in the world in a capitalist-dominated economy, and we are realistic, we're not going to live in some utopian year and make dreams a reality in the morning. We know the limitations that we face, even though we believe in a socialist future, but we know that we are currently dancing within the stomach of the beast. We're not going to dream that away. It doesn't happen. So we do accept that anywhere else in the world, whether you have a social democratic system or you have the brutal capitalist system applied in the United States, and you have some a little bit of a human face put on the capitalist system in big parts of Europe. But all of those governments are obliged, including in Cuba, by the way. I've been in Cuba and had countless hours of discussions with the leadership of both the party and the trade unions for years. And all of them had come to accept that it will be absolutely naive to just ignore the private sector and not play a role of ensuring that they come into the party, they invest, and their reasonable demands are considered. It will be, nobody lives in some utopian year. Any person who tells you that is mad. So we accept that that government must play that role. But let's look at the private sector in South Africa. Point one, the PwC have just published a report, not for the first time. And their report shows that the South African corporates are the second most corrupt in the world. That's the first point. Second point that we are continuously raising is that the corporates in South Africa are involved in what the Thabo Mbeki and many others call illicit cash outflows. And according to the Treasury, they're saying sometimes we lose up to 400 billion rands annually. That's how they're reciprocating Thabo Mbeki's strategy of opening South Africa up and allowing private firms to list in foreign currencies or stock exchanges. Thirdly, according to the Treasury officials again, they're saying we're losing between 35 and 40% of our procurement budget to tender fraud, to corruption. And they're saying sometimes that runs to 250 to 350 annually. According to to Judge Dennis Davis, who was asked to investigate the tax in South Africa, its integrity, its systems, its fairness, and all of that, he came out with a report that says the private firms, corporates, are involved in what he calls the aggressive tax dodging schemes, and that this economy loses sometimes 350 billion rands annually to those schemes. Now, that is what is creating deindustrialization in our country, in our view. And lastly, and more importantly, we told that the private firms in South Africa and individuals are hoarding up to 1.4 trillion rands cash in the banks. And thanks to the monetary policies of the government of chasing low inflation through keeping mechanically high interest rates, those individuals make between 3 and 4% of real profit after inflation, 3 to 4%, by just lying next to their pool, doing absolutely nothing, not involved in any productive economy, activity, nothing. So the strategy of using the private sector to be the sole leader of addressing the social ills we inherited from colonial and apartheid have simply failed in South Africa, completely dismally failed. And the statistics that were published yesterday on Monday point to that failure, and I've already told you what is the worst features of that statistics.
Right. Okay, I believe we've been joined by somebody else.
Yes, I've joined you.
Good morning, dear Professor.
Morning, sir. How are you?
I'm okay. How are you?
Let me come in on the points that you have eloquently actually put across, and in particular the kind of stimulus. Not to talk about the stimulus as such, but to say that the president correctly said that the COVID period and the post-COVID period must be different. The question that we have to ask ourselves as South Africans and ask the president is, will it be different given what we see now as the budget? And I think the budget is an instrument for executing the intentions. And this budget shows us that 269 billion will be sucked out of the president commanded that the COVID-19 post-period must be different. And I argued that the difference must be in the period of COVID and post-COVID. Because if we think about it post-COVID, everybody will have forgotten. When we got the vaccine, we'll say now life is normal, which means then we are back to where we were before COVID in terms of what. Now, what is very clear is that there are no tools to guarantee that that will be different. And yesterday's budget was a disappointing exploration of that future, that there's nothing that will be different.
Not enough.
It can be enough when you see 269 billion and a celebration of 3.3% growth. I mean, these are low base effects. There are things that are insulting to the intelligence of South Africans. When you celebrate and say there will be 3.3%, that's growing from a low base. Post that is 1%, 2%, which means we'll be in where we were pre-COVID by 2024. And then there is a narrative that is very disturbing. This narrative was never there before around population growth. It is being slid into the vocabulary of South Africans to say, no, we are growing at 3.3%, which is higher than population growth, and therefore we'll be making progress. We've grown at 5%. The population growth issue in South Africa has never been an issue because the population growth in South Africa has been very low. Even when we are growing at 5%, this never came into the equation to try and say we are growing at 3 times the size of the population growth. Now that narrative has been sliding. It is sliding at the same time as the 3%, which never was the target, not in RDP, not in NDP, and not even in the maligned gear. So you can see that there is a manipulation of the public perception by the politics of our time, at the time when we have a crisis, spinning mirrors and smoke. I think that's disingenuous and not right. We cannot bring those kinds of factors that at least population growth is not as high and we are at 3.3%. So it's lowering the accountability stakes by government without any consultation. The NDP, the RDP, of course, the gear was never consulted on, but the NDP and the RDP were consulted on, and the targets were 6%. Now we have decided we will reduce those targets, and in their place, we'll create a narrative. Growth. This is an introduction of a Malthusian theory, a Malthusian orientation that argues around population and growth. Yes, of course, growth has to be high, population growth may have to be lower, but it is the distribution of that population that counts and the quality of that population that counts. It is not the numerology that we are being sold by the politics of the day. And I detest this being smoke and mirrors when we are in the pandemic. And it is not good for the country. That's the first. The second thing is the desire for good news. Just before the State of the Nation address, a very reputable institution, the NEED, they've been doing fantastic work. I don't know what pressured them to hurry and deliver their report. They did, nonetheless. And now they came up with a theory that employment is gained, and the president, I don't know who advises the president. Those numbers, we could see them, that there's something wrong in these numbers because everything else was pointing negative. To now believe the jobs numbers, it's really indiscriminate. It shows that we are not led by science, we are led by something else, the desire for a good story to tell. So the president goes on podium to say that now the signals are there that jobs are returning. The Statistician-General yesterday, 2 days ago, showed that there are no jobs returning here. We are only 300,000. I don't know who holds the president to account on that, because his State of the Nation address, and therefore the budget, was anchored on the falsehood that jobs are returning, unless he didn't pay attention to what he said and to the facts. I think we have, if we are led by science, as the government said during the pandemic and the introduction of modeling, we must be led by science. It cannot be this way and that way. It must be science. So the needs survey has really tarnished itself because that institute and that institution is robust. I still suspect that there must be a programming glitch in the way they estimated things, because even if the sample was small, I doubt that it would have generated that extent of bias in the numbers. I doubt very much. I haven't looked at the programming of what they did. So these are some of the things that are there in the institution, and they are characteristic of the poverty of thinking and hankering after interesting news. Now, in the same budget, if you look at investment, well, government will invest an amount and so on, but even then, we will still be minus 2.8% from a drop of 18% last year to minus 2% this year. So running after austerity measures that are driven by debt to GDP ratio, and then saying at least if we can be 90%, who says 90%, 80% or 40% is a ratio that is affected by growth. To deal with debt to GDP, you have to grow the economy. And now to lower the lens to 3%, 3.3%, and bring a new narrative about population growth is disingenuous and is disrespecting of South Africa. Absolutely. So now, should we buy and then come and say that our macroeconomic pillars are sound? They are not. They are not. What has happened is that we have avoided to agree with the fact that macroeconomic pillars, and any economist will tell you what the macroeconomic pillars are. They include poverty, they are centrally employment, and inequality. Now, to say that they are sound when unemployment is 30% is false. So I'm just pointing to the falsehoods that anchor our body politic. And they're not different, therefore, these falsehoods, from the rampant destruction, because lies are pervasive. They are in our society, they are everywhere, and they are in our instruments of planning. Now, if you look at the way they have calculated these things, they're looking at it every 2 years. They have only the CGE model, and the CGE cannot project far enough because it has to deal with counter-cyclical to balance things, interest rates and so on. You cannot use that instrument to plan your 10-year horizon, 20-year horizon. You need a different set of tools, because to invest in a mine, to start a farm, to build human resources, to do all those things, you need a real instrument and tools that tell you what the future might look like. And you must, those tools of foresight are very crucial. CGE is not a tool of foresight. So we don't have tools of foresight. And we use them to come and deceive South Africans that there will be 3%. And now there's a language that says moderate growth over a period of time. It is not about high growth. It's about moderate growth that is sustained over a period of time. And then that brings in the narrative of population growth. All these things come to bring a different narrative, to try and bring the story of there is a good story to tell. There's no good story to tell here. So what are the things that we should be looking at? I think we really have a number of things that we have to look at that perhaps the president needs advice on, particularly to help him achieve what he said should be different post-COVID-19. And I would argue that it must be different during COVID-19, not different after. Because if COVID disappears, we'll all forget what is crucial here. And the different future, I mean, show that there is a weak, the statistics are showing a very weak economy. And I think what we have to have is about 5 interventions. And these 5 interventions have to pass through the eye of the needle. And first, we must understand economics is a complex issue, and policies relating to it will equally be complex, and we need complex tools to deal with it. The first is the micro reforms. Second, trade and industrial policy. Third, a macroeconomic and monetary policy. Fourth is agreement and commitment to growth targets. And fifth, public growth initiative, including growth and development strategies for provinces. If we bring all those together, we are likely to see a different future. If we leave the macroeconomic and monetary policy out of this equation, like Rob Davis, the former Minister of Trade and Industry, said, all these things like the microeconomic reforms, their growth will be sucked out by the absence of the macroeconomic. And Comrade Vavi has actually put these matters very clearly to us.
Right, so practically, what steps do you start taking? How does one go about all this?
Let me,
What?
I don't know whether you want me to share my screen. I usually like to be very, it's 2 slides I'll not take, and that will include what practically we should do.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, I mean, we've said that the stimulus is just 39 billion, which is just 1%. And, you know, for us to really think long-term, we must have a politically mobilizing philosophy. We must have a socially desirable futures, and we need an economically feasible space. I think in this regard, the politically mobilizing, there is none. You've seen it in the State of the Nation address, you have seen it in the Treasury budget. Is it socially desirable? No, it is not. Is it economically feasible? Yes, of course, the 2% growth is feasible, a 3% growth is feasible because the targets are very low. That's why I'm saying we need to agree on the targets of growth, and those are defined by consensus in the NDP and the RDP, including in the GEAR. Now, how does suddenly we revise the targets of the NDP? What is the framework of saying now in the next 10 years, we should only have 3% growth, and hopefully beyond that point, things will be better? What is the evidence that indeed things will be better? Where has it been modeled? What are the tools that have been used? Or is fundamentally the guesswork that Treasury has been gambling with each year lowering the targets, including on tax recovery? You see, this is what South Africa has put before us. The first is business for South Africa. In September last year, proposed that GDP outlook should be 550 billion, which will be equivalent to 8.3 trillion. Debt to GDP ratio 60%, that is 2030, target 2030. Standards and Poor rating, BBB, Gini coefficient 0.43 from 0.7, almost. Unemployment to 15%. The question is, what was the discussion in NADLAC? If Business for South Africa says, as business, these are the targets, if we look at all these 1,000 pages that we have produced, which were reduced to 120 projects or 120 pages, these are the results that we'll get. Where was this contested and discussed? Because I think the targets of business are very, very good and clear. Let's look at the targets and of government. 3%, they said a 3% growth, which next year will drop because we have dealt with the growth effects, the base effects. Debt to GDP ratio, now we learn it should be 90%. And we are looking at best a 4.5 trillion rands GDP by 2030. The consequences of that, which are not in the documents by the president or by Treasury, are that unemployment rate will be 30%.
Yes.
Gini coefficient will remain at about 50. Why are they not at about 67%? Why are they not issuing those projections? Because they must say, these 4.5 trillion, these 3% growth will buy us 30% unemployment by 2030, a Gini coefficient that is 67%, inequality that is much higher, and so on and so on. That must be upfront, that so that when we commit to this, to their targets, then we, now Gauteng, growing Gauteng together. Last year, SOPA, if you look at the SOPA of Gauteng, Mr. Makura, he said Gauteng, on the basis of that SOPA, will be a 2 trillion GDP growth, GDP size, which is just half the 4.5 trillion. But if you compare that 2 trillion with the 8 trillion of that is targeted by Business for South Africa, then it's 25%.
Right.
Poverty will be reduced from 25 to 16%. They are saying that based on the programs that they have as Gauteng, growing Gauteng together, they'll create 3.1 million jobs. The government, President and National Treasury say that in their projections, the jobs probably will be about 3.6 million. The last time on the paper, basis of the paper by Treasury is 1 million in 10 years.
Sure.
Gauteng says unemployment will be 15%.
Sure.
Now, the tools that have been used to project Gauteng are ADRS tools. And ADRS in its outlook with this foresight tool looks at 6.4 trillion GDP, debt to GDP ratio of 40%, jobs created almost 8 to 9 million, and unemployment dropping to 12%. If these were batteries that would power the economy, it looks to me that Business for South Africa is saying our battery is almost dead, but if we do the following things, our battery will be full. Gauteng says our battery is empty, it's almost empty, but if we do the following things, our battery will be full. What government is saying now is our battery is almost empty, but based on the projections and tools of foresight, by 2030, the president battery and the National Treasury, as they presented yesterday, will be empty. So which battery should we should we choose as South Africa? So we need tools of foresight, we need to agree on targets, and we need a ruthless program that achieves that, and we need a system that looks at the macroeconomy and how the role of the Treasury, of the Reserve Bank, and their role in employment creation as a macroeconomic variable. And we can't avoid that as a poverty variable, poverty as a macroeconomic variable, and inequality, together with all these things, debt to GDP ratio. The eclectic focus on GDP, debt to GDP ratio, will not take us anywhere. And thank you.
Thank you.